Blood spilled on pristine snow is a tragic sight, but a daughter sold to the slaughter is far worse. Betrayed by her father, she walked into the enemy's fortress, expecting a brutal demise. She didn't know the ruthless Alpha King, waiting for her, had already marked her soul in the shadows. The carriage wheels ground against the frozen earth, a rhythmic crunching that sounded like bones snapping beneath the weight of impending doom. Vivian sat rigidly inside, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white beneath her thin, worn gloves. Outside the frosted glass, the jagged peaks of the Black Iron Mountains loomed like the teeth of a giant beast waiting to swallow her whole. This was the territory of the Iron Ridge Pack, the enemy, the monsters who had decimated her people for the better part of a decade. Vivian belonged to the House of Ashbourne, a once proud lineage that ruled the lowland valleys. But pride could not stop the slaughter. Her father, Alpha Liam, had waged a foolish, desperate war over territorial borders and access to the silver mines of the north. He had lost drastically. The fields of Ashbourne were soaked in the blood of their warriors, and to save his own skin and the remnants of his crumbling pack, Liam had brokered a coward's peace. He had offered up his daughter. Not Clara, his eldest and favoured child, who sat safely by the hearth in their ancestral keep, shielded by her mother, Lady Beatrice. It was Vivian, the quiet, overlooked middle child, who was thrown to the wolves, quite literally. The treaty was absolute. A bride for Alpha King Gideon of Iron Ridge, a physical manifestation of Ashbourne's surrender. Vivian was to be a hostage, a breeder, or a sacrifice, depending entirely on the notorious cruelty of a king she had never met. "My lady, we are approaching the outer gates," whispered Lord Hastings, an elderly counsellor who was the only member of her pack brave enough to accompany her to her execution. His voice trembled, betraying the terror he tried to mask behind courtly formalities. Vivian did not look at him. She couldn't. If she broke her gaze from the frozen landscape, the tears she had sworn to hold back would fall, and she refused to give her enemies the satisfaction of a weeping bride. "Thank you, Hastings," she murmured, her voice steady despite the chaotic hammering of her heart. "You will leave as soon as I am delivered. Do not linger. The king's hospitality is not something I wish you to test." The carriage lurched as it passed beneath the colossal iron portcullis of Gideon's fortress. The castle of Iron Ridge was carved directly into the dark granite of the mountain, a sprawling, terrifying monument of stone, spiked parapets, and flickering torches that seemed to bleed against the twilight sky. The courtyard was swarming with soldiers, massive men and women clad in heavy furs and dark leather, their eyes glinting with the unmistakable gold and amber hues of their inner beasts. As the carriage rolled to a halt, the courtyard fell utterly silent. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, pregnant with malice. The door was wrenched open, not by a servant, but by a towering warrior with a scar bisecting his face. This was Beta Cassius, the king's right hand, and the butcher of the lowlands. Vivian recognized his description from the terrified whispers of her father's surviving soldiers. "Step down, Ashbourne," Cassius rumbled, his voice like gravel scraping over iron. He did not offer a hand. Vivian gathered the skirts of her simple, unadorned traveling gown, a deliberate insult from her father, sending her without the silks and jewels befitting a royal exchange. She stepped out into the biting cold, her chin held high. The wind howled through the courtyard, cutting through her meager cloak, but she forced herself to stand tall. Hundreds of eyes bored into her. She could smell their hostility, the sharp, acrid scent of wolves holding back a collective snarl. To them, she was the daughter of the man who had murdered their kin. "Where is the king?" Lord Hastings squeaked from the carriage step, his knees visibly shaking. Cassius turned a baleful glare on the old man. "The king waits in the great hall. Only the tribute enters. You, old man, will turn this rotting carriage around and ride back to your coward of an alpha before I decide to make a meal of your horses." Hastings looked at Vivian, a desperate apology swimming in his watery eyes. She gave him a sharp, curt nod. "Go, Hastings. Tell my father the debt is paid." As the carriage hurriedly clattered out of the courtyard, sealing her fate, Cassius gestured toward the massive oak doors of the keep. "Walk." Every step Vivian took echoed like a death knell. The fortress corridors were dimly lit, the stone walls radiating a chill that seeped deep into her marrow. Tapestries depicting brutal hunts and ancient wolf lore hung in the shadows. The sheer masculine, predatory energy of the place was overwhelming. Vivian was a wolf, yes, but her wolf was small, quiet, and currently curled into a trembling ball at the back of her mind, terrified by the overwhelming scent of apex predators. Yet, amid the fear, a strange sensation began to prickle at the base of her skull. It was a phantom warmth, a bizarre feeling of déjà vu that made no sense. She had never been to the north. She had never set foot in Iron Ridge. But the flickering shadows against the stone, the distant sound of a hunting horn, it all felt inexplicably familiar. She pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to sheer exhaustion and terror. Cassius pushed open the heavy double doors at the end of the corridor, revealing the great hall. It was a cavernous space, lit by a roaring hearth fire, large enough to roast an ox whole. Dozens of high-ranking pack members lined the walls, their expressions ranging from cold indifference to outright hatred. Lady Isolde, an aristocratic wolf with sharp features and a cruel smirk, whispered something to a companion as Vivian walked past. But Vivian barely noticed them. Her eyes were drawn, as if by a magnetic force, to the dais at the end of the hall. There sat Alpha King Gideon. He was a nightmare forged in flesh and bone. Broad-shouldered and impossibly tall even while seated, he wore garments of spun black wool and silver armor. His hair was as dark as a raven's wing, falling in unkempt waves around a face carved from harsh, unforgiving angles. But it was his eyes that stopped Vivian's breath in her throat. They were not the amber of common wolves, nor the icy blue of the northerners. They were molten gold, piercing, heavy, and ancient. Vivian stopped a few paces from the steps of the dais, refusing to bow. She was a sacrifice, but she was still royalty. Gideon stared down at her in absolute silence. The tension in the hall stretched until it felt like a physical wire ready to snap. He didn't sneer. He didn't boast. He simply observed her, his chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic cadence. Then, the king leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. When he spoke, his voice resonated through the stone floor, vibrating up through Vivienne's boots. "So, Liam sends me his discarded pup." Laughter rippled through the hall, cruel and sharp. Beta Cassius sneered from the sidelines, while Lady Isolde openly scoffed. Vivian's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she locked her gaze with the king's. "My father sent what was agreed upon, Your Grace," Vivian replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the hurricane of panic in her chest. "The bloodline of Ashbourne. A treaty sealed." Gideon stood. The sheer size of him was staggering. He descended the stone steps with the silent, lethal grace of a stalking panther. As he drew closer, the suffocating scent of the hall, sweat, wet fur, wood smoke, and hostility, seemed to vanish, replaced by something entirely different. It was a scent that hit Vivian like a physical blow. Petrichor, crushed pine needles, the sharp metallic tang of ozone right before a lightning strike. Vivian gasped, stumbling back half a step. Her eyes widened in absolute shock, the carefully constructed mask of defiance shattering into pieces. No, it's impossible. For the past 2 years, Vivian had suffered from relentless, vivid dreams. In the suffocating confines of her father's oppressive home, where she was treated as an afterthought, her only solace had been the dreamscape. In those nightly visions, she wandered a dense, ethereal forest shrouded in silver mist, and she was never alone. A massive, shadowy wolf with eyes like molten gold would appear. He never spoke, but he would walk beside her, his massive side brushing against her leg, offering a profound, soul-deep comfort she had never known in the waking world. He protected her from the nightmares of her father's rage. He was her secret guardian, a phantom of her own lonely mind, and his scent, the scent that flooded her senses every time she woke up clutching her pillows in the dark, was petrichor, pine, and ozone. Gideon stopped just inches from her. Up close, the intensity in his golden eyes was almost unbearable. He was looking at her not as a conquered prize, but with a sudden, violent recognition. The subtle flare of his nostrils told her he was pulling in her scent, lavender, sweet milk, and the crisp winter air. The king's hands, clad in dark leather, twitched. He looked down at her trembling frame, at her wide, terrified eyes, and the aggressive posture of his broad shoulders minutely shifted. "You," Gideon breathed. The word was so low that only she could hear it, carried on a vibration that made her inner wolf whimper, not in fear, but in profound, desperate yearning. Vivian couldn't speak. Her mind was reeling. How? The lore of the moon goddess spoke of many things: soulmates, fated bonds, destiny. But dream walking, astral projection, between two wolves who had never met? It was a myth, a fairy tale whispered by the elders to romantic pups. Yet standing before her was the phantom of her sleep, rendered in terrifying, glorious reality. Before Vivian could process the revelation, Cassius stepped forward. "My king, shall I have her thrown in the dungeon? Or perhaps the lower quarters with the servants? Liam insulted us by sending a frail, magicless runt in peasant's clothing. We should send her back to him in pieces." A chorus of murmurs agreed. Lady Isolde stepped out from the crowd, her eyes flashing with jealousy and malice. "Cassius is right, my king. She is a spy. A Trojan horse sent by Ashbourne to poison our pack from within. Look at her. She's weak. She brings no glory to Ironridge." Gideon didn't look at them. His golden eyes remained locked on Vivian's face, studying the delicate curve of her jaw, the fearful, rapid pulse beating at the base of her throat. Slowly he raised a hand. The entire hall fell dead silent. No one dared breathe. Gideon reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently tracing the line of her cold cheek. The contrast between the butcher of the north and the terrifying gentleness of his touch sent a violent shiver down Vivian's spine. A spark of pure, unadulterated electricity jumped between their skin. "A runt," Gideon repeated softly, his voice a dangerous purr. He finally turned his head to look at Cassius, and the air in the room turned to ice. "You dare speak of my mate with such disrespect, Cassius?" The word dropped like a boulder in a quiet pond. "Mate." Pandemonium erupted in the great hall. Cassius balked, taking a step back as if he had been struck. "Mate, King Gideon, surely you jest. She is an Ashbourne. Her father murdered. Her father's crimes are his own." Gideon roared, the sound unleashing a shockwave of alpha command that forced half the wolves in the room to their knees. Vivian swayed, overwhelmed by the sheer power radiating from him. But before her knees could buckle, Gideon's arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his hard, armored chest. "She is not a hostage," Gideon declared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "She is not a servant, and she is certainly not a sacrifice. She is Vivian." He said her name as if he had known it all his life, rolling it over his tongue with a fierce reverence. "She is the Queen of Ironridge. The goddess has decreed it. Anyone who questions her place here, anyone who looks at her with disrespect, will answer to my claws." Vivian clung to his tunic, her world spinning. He knew. He had known her in the dreams, just as she had known him. He hadn't just claimed her in the Great Hall. He had claimed her soul months ago in the sanctuary of her mind. But as Gideon hoisted her effortlessly into his arms, carrying her past the stunned, glaring faces of his court, Vivian realized the true danger had only just begun. The wolves of Ironridge would never accept the daughter of their sworn enemy as their Luna. And as Lady Isolde watched them ascend the grand staircase, her eyes burning with lethal intent, Vivian knew that while she may have survived her father's betrayal, surviving her new kingdom would require more than just a dream. The heavy oak door to the king's private chambers slammed shut, the booming echo vibrating through the stones. Gideon set Vivian down slowly, as if she were made of spun glass, his massive hands lingering on her waist before reluctantly falling to his sides. The room was vast, dominated by a massive four-poster bed, draped in black furs, a roaring fireplace, and towering bookshelves. It smelled intensely of him, that intoxicating blend of petrichor, pine, and ozone. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of 100 unspoken questions and the lingering adrenaline from the great hall. "You thought I was a phantom," Gideon finally said, his voice a low, rough rumble. He ran a hand through his dark hair, pacing to the window that overlooked the frozen tundra. "A trick of the mind, a spirit conjured by the moon goddess to torment me with a mate I could never touch." Vivian stood frozen in the center of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. I thought I was losing my mind," she confessed, her voice trembling. "In my father's house I was nothing, a shadow. The dreams were my only escape. When the wolf with the golden eyes appeared in the silver mist, I thought he was just a guardian my mind created to keep the loneliness at bay." Gideon turned, his golden eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive light. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just inches from her. He reached out, his knuckles gently brushing against her jawline. "I am no phantom, Vivian, and you are no shadow. You are a spirit walker. It is an ancient, rare bloodline magic. You reached across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, through the wards of my fortress, and pulled my soul into your dreamscape. Your father thought you were weak because you lacked the physical strength of a warrior. He was a fool. You have the mind of a queen." Vivian's breath hitched. "A spirit walker?" The old tales spoke of wolves who could traverse the astral plane, communicating through dreams and reading the emotional currents of those around them. She had always felt things too deeply, sensing the hidden malice in her father's court, the unspoken fears of the servants. She had buried it, terrified of being labeled a freak. "They will not accept me, Gideon," she whispered, looking down at his armored chest. "You saw their faces. Cassius, Isolde. They look at me and see the blood of Ashbourne. They see the enemy. They will see their Luna," Gideon growled, his thumb tracing her lower lip. "Or they will see nothing at all, for I will blind any wolf who dares to disrespect you. But you must be careful, little bird. Iron Ridge is a fortress, but it is also a viper's nest. My pack values strength above all. You must show them you are not prey." A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Gideon's posture instantly stiffened, stepping protectively in front of Vivian. "Enter." The door creaked open, and a young maid stepped inside, carrying a silver tray with a steaming basin of water, linens, and a goblet of dark wine. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, her shoulders hunched in submission. "Forgive the intrusion, my king. Lady Isolde requested I bring the new bride a basin to wash away the dust of the road and a tonic to calm her nerves. She says it is a traditional welcome." "Leave it on the table, Martha," Gideon said dismissively. The maid, Martha Jenkins, a human servant whose family had served the fortress for generations, hurriedly set the tray down. But as she did, her hand brushed against the silver goblet, and a violent tremor shook her frame. Vivian frowned. Her newly awakened understanding of her spirit walker abilities flared to life. As she looked at Martha, the edges of the room blurred. A suffocating wave of terror, guilt, and a sickly, dark aura of malice washed over her. It wasn't Martha's malice. It was a residual energy clinging to the goblet. "Wait!" Vivian commanded. Her voice surprised even herself. It was firm, carrying a strange, resonant authority. Martha froze, her eyes darting to the door. Vivian stepped around Gideon, approaching the table. She stared at the goblet of wine. The liquid was a rich ruby red, but a faint, almost invisible wisp of purple smoke curled from its surface. Something only her spirit sight could detect. She reached out, hovering her fingers over the rim. A sharp, burning sensation bit into her skin. Wolfsbane, concentrated, refined, and lethal. "Who gave you this, Martha?" Vivian asked softly, though her eyes were locked on the terrified maid. Martha burst into tears, dropping to her knees. "I didn't want to, my lady. I swear it. Lady Isolde. She told me if I didn't bring the tonic to you, she would have my brother, Arthur Jenkins, banished to the frozen wastes. She said it was just a sleeping draught to keep you docile for the king." A terrifying snarl ripped through the room. Gideon's eyes flared into a monstrous, glowing gold, his claws extending from his fingertips as his inner beast surged to the surface. He lunged toward the door, his intent to tear Isolde limb from limb radiating from him in waves of pure, murderous alpha dominance. "Gideon, stop!" Vivian shouted, grabbing his arm. Her small hands were nothing against his massive strength, but her voice, laced with the calming, tethering magic of their bond, halted him in his tracks. He looked down at her, his chest heaving, his fangs bared. "She tried to murder my mate in my own home. I will mount her head on a pike in the courtyard. And prove my father right? Prove to your pack that you are a blind, bloodthirsty beast ruled by a foreign bride?" Vivian countered, her voice fiercely steady. She squeezed his arm. "If you kill her now, without public proof, you make her a martyr. Her faction will rise against you. The pack will fracture. We cannot rule through terror alone." Gideon's muscles bunched under her grip, but slowly the glowing gold in his eyes receded to a smoldering amber. He breathed in her scent, lavender and sweet milk, letting it ground him. "Then what do you propose, my queen?" Vivian turned to look at the weeping maid, then at the poisoned goblet. A dangerous, brilliant plan began to form in her mind. "Tomorrow night is the blood moon ceremony," she said, her voice dropping to a cool, calculating whisper. "Let Lady Isolde believe she has won. Let her believe I drank the poison and am growing weak. When she steps forward to claim my place, We will expose her treachery for all of Ironridge to see." The night of the blood moon ceremony descended upon the Black Iron Mountains like a heavy velvet shroud. The courtyard of the fortress was illuminated by massive bonfires, casting long, dancing shadows against the ancient stone. The entire Ironridge pack had gathered, hundreds of wolves standing shoulder to shoulder, their breath pluming in the freezing air. At the center of the courtyard stood the ancient moonstone, the sacred altar where Alpha Kings claimed their lunars before the goddess. Gideon stood at the head of the stone, radiating a terrifying, regal authority. Beside him stood Vivian. She looked pale, her skin almost translucent under the crimson light of the moon. She leaned heavily against the stone, her breaths shallow. To the untrained eye, she looked like a weak, dying creature, succumbing to the harsh northern climate. In the front row, Lady Isolde watched with barely concealed triumph. Beside her, Beta Cassius looked on with grim impatience. "People of Ironridge," Gideon's voice boomed over the crackling fires. "Tonight, beneath the blood moon, I stand before you to formally claim my mate, Vivian of House Ashbourne, as your lunar." A low, collective growl rippled through the pack. It was a sound of deep, instinctual rejection. Isolde stepped forward, her smirk dripping with false sympathy. "My king, forgive me, but the goddess requires strength. Look at her. The North is rejecting her weak, southern blood. To bind her to our pack is to bind us to a corpse." Murmurs swept through the crowd. Cassius nodded. "She speaks the truth, Gideon. Ashbourne insulted us. Let the girl die and take a true northern wolf as your mate." Isolde subtly preened, her ambitions blindingly obvious. Gideon looked at Isolde, a deadly calm in his eyes. "And you believe you are that wolf, Isolde?" "I have the strength and the loyalty of this pack," she declared, stepping onto the dais. "Step aside, little bird. Let the true wolves handle the North." Vivian's eyes fluttered open. The pale, sickly facade vanished in a heartbeat. She pushed herself off the stone, standing perfectly straight. The sudden surge of energy from her sent a shock wave through the courtyard. She didn't look at Isolde. She looked past the crowd, her spirit walker senses screaming a sudden, terrifying warning. "Gideon," Vivian whispered through their mind link. "Treachery. It's not just Isolde." Before anyone could react, the deafening blast of a war horn shattered the night. The heavy iron gates exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood. Roars of fury erupted as a massive force of armed mercenaries flooded into the courtyard. At the head of the invading army rode a man clad in silver armor. It was Alpha Liam of Ashbourne. "Kill the king! Burn the fortress!" Liam bellowed. He had never intended to surrender. The treaty was a Trojan horse to lower Ironridge's defenses. He had allied with a notorious mercenary, Commander Thomas Bradley, a warlord who cared only for gold. Chaos erupted. The Ironridge wolves shifted into their beast forms, lunging at the invaders. Blood sprayed against the snow. Cassius drew his swords and dived into the fray, his loyalty to the pack overriding his disdain for the bride. On the dais, Isolde saw her plan unraveling. In a fit of panicked rage, she drew a hidden dagger and lunged at Vivian's back. "Die, you southern bitch!" But Vivian was no longer the frightened girl. She tapped into her ancient spirit walker magic. As Isolde's blade descended, Vivian spun around, her eyes glowing with ethereal silver light. She thrust her hands forward, sending a psychic shockwave directly into Isolde's mind. Isolde screamed, dropping the dagger and collapsing as the raw, unfiltered terror paralyzed her. Below them, Gideon was a god of war. Shifted into a monstrous, pitch-black wolf with glowing golden eyes, he tore through the mercenaries, defending the dais. Liam spurred his horse forward. "Traitor!" he screamed at Vivian. "You ruined everything!" Gideon intercepted the charge. With a deafening roar, the black wolf leaped, colliding with the horse. Liam scrambled to his feet, swinging his sword, but Gideon's massive jaws snapped around his arm, crushing the bone. Liam fell screaming. The remaining mercenaries, seeing Bradley ripped apart by Cassius, fled into the night. Gideon shifted back, covered in the blood of his enemies. He grabbed Liam by the throat, dragged him up the steps, and threw him at Vivian's feet. "Your father, my queen," Gideon rumbled, handing her a silver dagger. "His fate is yours to decide, as is hers." He nodded toward Isolde. The pack held its breath. Would she show the weakness of her bloodline, or claim her crown in blood? Vivian looked at Liam. She could end him, but as she felt the steady bond of her shared soul with Gideon, she realized she was a protector, not a butcher. She lowered the dagger. "You sold me to the wolves, father. You thought you threw me to my death, but you only threw me into my destiny." She turned to the pack. "Take Liam to the deepest dungeon. Let him rot, knowing his daughter rules the kingdom he tried to destroy. Strip Isolde of her rank and banish her to the frozen wastes." A stunned silence hung in the air. Then, Beta Cassius, bleeding from a dozen wounds, stepped forward and dropped to one knee. One by one, the wolves of Iron Ridge followed suit. Hundreds of warriors knelt in the bloody snow, acknowledging the power, mercy, and undeniable right of their new queen. Gideon wrapped his massive arms around her waist, inhaling the scent of lavender and victory. "My Luna," he whispered. And as the blood moon bathed the fortress in light, the girl sold as a bargain found her true home. Did Vivian's brave choice and Gideon's fierce love capture your heart? The world of Iron Ridge is full of untold secrets, and this is just the beginning of their reign. If you loved this werewolf romance drama, smash that like button. Share the story with your fellow fantasy lovers, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another epic tale. Let us know in the comments what you think.